General George S. Patton believed that speed could overcome any logistical deficit, but on February 14, 1943, the Tunisian desert taught him a brutal lesson in arithmetic. As the Kasserine Pass turned into an Allied graveyard, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a move that shocked the command. He demanded Patton fix a shattered supply chain by turning logistics into a lethal administrative weapon. This wasn't just a repair job. It was a total overhaul of how American commanders wielded power. By imposing this hidden supply chain reform, did Eisenhower finally leash Patton's ego? Or did he unknowingly force a legendary general to learn how to manipulate the theater's resources to his own tactical ends? If a general's power is measured by the bullets he can fire, what happens when the man behind the desk decides exactly how many shells the general is allowed to use? General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then the supreme Allied commander, was forced to confront the reality that his theater was being throttled by its own immaturity. His professional development, rooted in the staff sections of the War Department, had taught him that global coalition warfare was an industrial marathon where the supply chain was the absolute boundary of operational possibility. Eisenhower realized that a brilliant plan was worthless if it outran its fuel, ammunition, and communications. Yet he was under immense pressure from Washington. General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, had personally championed Fredendall's appointment, and the collapse at Kasserine was a stinging blow to his institutional judgment. Marshall understood that the Pacific and Eastern fronts were competing for every ton of shipping, and he kept Eisenhower on a tight leash regarding resource consumption. When Eisenhower finally dispatched Major General Omar Bradley and Major General Ernest Harmon to inspect Second Corps, what they found was a command climate of geographic isolation and total systemic dysfunction. Harmon discovered Fredendall sleep-deprived and administratively paralyzed, while Bradley confirmed that the division commanders had lost all faith in their leader. The audit conducted by Brigadier General Everett S. E. Hughes, the deputy theater commander, revealed a supply system that was essentially blind. Hughes noted sardonically in his diary that Second Corps had destroyed its own infrastructure, and his audit identified that base section officers were ignoring shipping documentation, leading to critical bottlenecks at the ports. There was no standardized way to prioritize cargo, and the railway system was chronically congested. Eisenhower saw the audit's conclusion. The Allied campaign was failing because the American Army was treating logistics as a secondary service that should conform to the will of the commander, rather than the foundation upon which all tactical movement rested. Eisenhower had no choice but to relieve Fredendall, and his eyes turned to the man who possessed the unique combat dynamism to revitalize a demoralized force, Major General George S. Patton. Patton's philosophy, however, was fundamentally irreconcilable with Eisenhower's systems engineering approach. To Patton, logistics was a subordinate utility that existed solely to sustain his momentum. He believed that a determined field commander could overcome any physical resource limitation through sheer force of will. Eisenhower recognized that he had to harness Patton's aggressiveness while shackling it to a rigid logistical framework. He sent Patton to Second Corps with explicit instructions: standardize procedures, enforce strict discipline, and rehabilitate the logistics of the unit with all possible speed. But Eisenhower also knew that Patton would push his forces to the edge of operational culmination, and that the only way to control a commander who refused to be stopped was to control the flow of fuel and ammunition that powered his tanks. The reforms that Eisenhower and his Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith, forced upon Second Corps were a masterclass in the weaponization of logistics. They were not interested in Patton's neckties or helmets, although those served their own purpose. They were focused on the transition to asset status reports. Before this, requisitioning was based on qualitative guesses. Now it was based on precise mathematical calculations of vehicle consumption rates and inventory counts. One of the most effective technical interventions was the standardization of the jerrycan identification protocol. To stop the catastrophic mixing of fuel octanes, which destroyed tank engines on the battlefield, Eisenhower's quartermaster staff enforced a system where wire strands were wrapped around the handles of these cans to indicate octane levels. It was a simple, tactile solution that worked in the dark under blackout conditions, ensuring that tracked vehicles received the correct fuel while wheeled units got their own. Patton, realizing the power of British ultra-decryption, allowed his intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar W. Koch, to project German movements with eerie accuracy. This wasn't just about finding the enemy. It allowed the G4 logistics section to configure forward supply points precisely where they were needed, preventing the overallocation of scarce transport to areas where no battle would occur. Eisenhower also bypassed the long, fragile supply lines running from Casablanca and Iran by constituting the eastern-based section under Colonel Arthur W. Pence. By positioning this logistics hub closer to the front, they cut the transit time and provided a predictable daily flow of rations and fuel. It was a cold, mathematical approach to warfare, a pipeline reserve coefficient that accounted for wastage and transit losses, ensuring the Second Corps never ran dry again. Yet as Patton's success grew, so did the friction. Eisenhower and Bedell Smith systematically weaponized these logistical choke points to ensure that Patton's aggressive drives remained aligned with broader coalition strategy. When Patton seethed under the restrictions of General Alexander's 18th Army Group, which relegated him to a diversionary role, Eisenhower used fuel and shipping allotments to keep him on a leash. Patton wanted to drive his armor directly to the coast and cut Rommel's lines, but Eisenhower held the keys to the pump. On March 16, 1943, just before the offensive at El Getter, Eisenhower met Patton privately for a final briefing. He knew Patton's history of disregarding logistical security for tactical speed, and he warned him plainly, "I want you as a corps commander, not as a casualty." Patton accepted the orders, but his team was already looking for administrative loopholes. Everett Hughes, serving as Eisenhower's special assistant, watched as units began to engage in dubious bookkeeping to bypass the rigid regulations. Units engaged in active combat began requisitioning replacements 48 hours in advance of expected losses, effectively gaming the system to keep their ranks full. The logistical machine was becoming standardized, but the soldiers on the ground were realizing that the system had its own weaknesses that could be exploited by anyone who knew how to balance the books. The unsung heroes like Colonel Andrew T. McNamara, the Second Corps quartermaster, were performing miracles behind the scenes. During the Kasserine crisis, it was McNamara's independent decision to ignore the bureaucratic process and evacuate forward supply dumps that saved over 1 million rations and 500,000 gallons of gasoline. If he had waited for an order, the supplies would have been captured by the advancing German panzers. Prepared for the final push in Tunisia, the logistical architecture was firmly in place. But Patton was still looking for ways to maneuver beyond Eisenhower's control. The tension was reaching a breaking point. Eisenhower demanded a standardized, synchronized coalition effort, while Patton was looking for the one gap in the logistics chain that would allow him to prove that speed was the ultimate weapon. The stage is now set for a confrontation between the man who builds a system and the man who lives to break it. As the Allied forces finalize their plans for the invasion of Sicily, a critical decision regarding resource allocation is about to be made in the High Command, a decision that will either accelerate the liberation of Europe or trap the Allied forces in an administrative bottleneck of their own making. What information is Eisenhower currently hiding from Patton to prevent him from initiating an unauthorized drive? And will Patton's administrative bypasses finally collapse the very system that Eisenhower fought so hard to build? The tactical and administrative metamorphosis of the American Second Corps in the aftermath of the Kasserine Pass was not a sudden epiphany. It was a grueling, systematic reconstruction of the very concept of military power in a global conflict. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, operating from his headquarters in Algiers, realized that the failure at Sidi Bouzid was not merely an indictment of General Lloyd Fredendall's leadership, but a catastrophic proof that the American Army was attempting to fight a 20th century industrial war with 19th century administrative habits. To rectify this, Eisenhower initiated a series of radical reforms that turned the logistical tail of the Army into a proactive, forward-deployed weapon. He began by stripping away the layers of bureaucratic incompetence that had clogged the North African ports, replacing them with a rigorous, data-driven system of supply management that prioritized the needs of the front line over the convenience of base-level administrators. The key to this transformation was the implementation of the Asset Status Report, a tool that Eisenhower personally championed to ensure that no division commander, Patton included, could operate in a vacuum. Before these reports, the flow of supplies was reactive, based on requests that were often inflated or fundamentally inaccurate. Under the new regime, every unit was required to submit precise daily accounting of their fuel, ammunition, and rations. While Patton famously referred to these requirements as pencil-pushing nonsense that hindered the momentum of his armor, he quickly discovered that the reliability of the supplies arriving at his doorstep increased exponentially. This reliability was the crucial bridge that allowed him to maintain his aggressive pace without the constant fear of sudden logistical collapse. Eisenhower's next move was the institutionalization of the base section concept, which sought to bring the administrative machinery of the rear areas much closer to the combat zone. Colonel Arthur W. Pence, serving as the head of the Eastern Base Section, was tasked with shortening the distance between the source of supply and the tanks that required them. By shifting these depots forward, Eisenhower reduced the transit time and the vulnerability of the supply lines to enemy disruption, effectively creating a pipeline that pulsed in sync with the tactical movements of the Army. This was not just a reorganization, it was an act of strategic engineering that allowed the American Army to sustain high-intensity operations in the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Tunisia. The integration of intelligence and logistics was perhaps the most sophisticated innovation implemented during this period. Colonel Oscar W. Koch, Patton's intelligence officer, began working in close concert with the G4 logistics section, using decrypted ultra-intercepts to predict exactly where the German defense was brittle. By mapping these intelligence projections onto their logistical distribution plans, they were able to pre-position fuel and ammunition at forward supply points just as the tactical need arose. This synergy turned the logistics network into a proactive entity that anticipated the commander's needs, rather than a slow, unresponsive service that waited for orders to arrive. As the planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, proceeded, the friction between Eisenhower's systems approach and Patton's personality-driven leadership reached a fever pitch. Patton demanded total freedom of maneuver, while Eisenhower insisted that the 7th Army must remain within the strict logistical allocation he had set for the entire theater. This was not merely an argument over fuel, it was a fundamental clash over who controlled the narrative of the war. Eisenhower understood that a coalition force had to be managed as a cohesive whole, whereas Patton was convinced that if he could only be unchained, he would end the war through sheer, unrelenting speed. The decision to limit Patton's fuel in Sicily was one of the most controversial and significant acts of Eisenhower's career. By keeping the 7th Army on a short leash, he ensured that Patton remained synchronized with the British 8th Army, a move that prevented a premature, isolated breakout that could have led to a disastrous overextension. Patton was furious, but he ultimately complied, and in doing so, he learned the most valuable lesson of his career: how to maximize tactical results within the constraints of a rigid, theater-wide logistical framework. His subsequent success in driving toward Messina was a direct result of this newfound discipline. The logistical race to Messina showcased the effectiveness of the mobile recovery crews that Patton had insisted on building. While other commanders abandoned damaged vehicles, Patton's recovery units were trained to work under fire, treating every broken-down tank as a resource that could be resurrected within hours. This created a resilient cycle that allowed the 7th Army to maintain its operational tempo even when it should have been forced to halt for repairs. It was this commitment to sustaining equipment in the field that finally won the respect of the more traditional staff officers in the Allied headquarters. The rivalry with Montgomery, which was so often defined by complaints about supply priorities, served a deeper, unintended purpose. It forced the Allied High Command to be incredibly precise in their justifications for every logistical allocation, which in turn forced the subordinate units to be more efficient. Eisenhower's staff would produce detailed audit logs that proved the allocation was based on actual consumption rates and objective needs. This forced Montgomery, in turn, to tighten his own logistical operations, inadvertently strengthening the entire Allied coalition. The systematic approach to logistics became the backbone of the entire Allied strategy in the Mediterranean. The lessons learned in the Tunisian desert and refined in the Sicilian campaign were translated into the massive logistical plans for the cross-channel invasion of France. The same wire strand identification protocols for jerry cans and the same centralized reporting systems were scaled up to support the millions of men who would eventually storm the beaches of Normandy. The logistical machine that Eisenhower built was not just a local solution, it was a blueprint for modern industrial warfare. At the heart of the success were individuals like Colonel Andrew T. McNamara, who understood that in a total war, the logistics officer had to be as aggressive as the infantry commander. McNamara and his counterparts didn't just manage supplies. They actively negotiated for resources, navigated the complex bureaucracy of the War Department, and fought for every ton of shipping space they could secure. They were the silent architects of victory, ensuring that the frontline forces never had to worry about the fundamental necessities of the fight. Their ability to forecast demand and optimize distribution was a level of management that the Axis powers never successfully replicated. The resolution of the friction between Patton and Eisenhower was, in the end, a testament to the fact that leadership in wartime is not about the absence of conflict, but the ability to harness it. Eisenhower needed Patton's aggression to win the war, and Patton needed Eisenhower's systems to sustain that aggression over long distances. This symbiosis was the defining feature of the Allied command structure, a partnership that, while frequently strained by ego and competing priorities, remained united by a shared absolute commitment to the defeat of the Axis. We must recognize that the hidden supply chain reform was not a betrayal of the individual field commander, but rather his ultimate enfranchisement. By providing Patton with a predictable, consistent supply flow, Eisenhower actually empowered him to take risks he could never have justified without such a foundation. It was the transition from amateur, ad hoc logistics to professional, institutionalized supply that allowed Patton to become the legend he is remembered as today. His genius was enabled, not suppressed, by the very system he once fought to escape. The legacy of these reforms is evident in every modern enterprise that seeks to balance the drive for innovation with the necessity of disciplined process. Corporations, like armies, must build foundations of resilience that can withstand the shocks of the marketplace, prioritizing data, standardized communication, and a clear understanding of their own resource limitations. The historical lesson of the Kasserine and Sicilian campaigns is that victory belongs to those who can manage the boring, quiet, and essential work of supply with as much intensity as they manage the loud, dramatic work of frontline competition. As we reflect on these events, we must conclude that the transformation of the Second Corps was one of the most important, yet least understood, chapters of World War II. It was the moment the American military came of age, not just in terms of combat capability, but in the sophisticated management of the tools of that combat. The story of the men who built this system is a story of quiet, profound professionalism that deserves a place alongside the more celebrated stories of the battlefield. In conclusion, the partnership between Eisenhower and Patton remains a masterclass in the necessity of balancing different, often opposing leadership styles. Their story confirms that great victories are rarely the product of a single individual's brilliance, but the outcome of a complex collective effort that merges tactical boldness with organizational genius. It is a story that continues to resonate, providing essential insights into the nature of power, command, and the often invisible, but always decisive role of logistics in the history of human conflict. Do you believe Patton would have been as successful in France if he hadn't been forced to master logistical discipline under Eisenhower's leash during the North African and Sicilian campaigns? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.